She knocked on the stranger's door not because she wanted to, but because her 3 children were minutes away from freezing to death in the Montana blizzard. And the man who opened it was about to change all their lives forever. Grace Morgan pulled her threadbare wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the fabric did little against the wind that cut through the valley like God's own fury. The snow came sideways now, each flake a tiny blade slashing across her face, stealing what little warmth remained in her body. Behind her, 3 small figures trudged through drifts that reached their waists, their breath coming in sharp puffs that froze before hitting the ground. "Mama?" Tommy whispered, his 10-year-old voice barely audible above the howling wind. "I can't feel my feet." Grace turned back to her children, her heart breaking at the sight of them. Tommy trying so hard to be the man of the family since his father had ridden away 3 days ago. 8-year-old Lucy, clinging to her brother's coat sleeve, her lips blue beneath the woolen scarf Grace had wrapped around her face. And little Jamie, just 5 years old, stumbling through the snow with tears frozen on his cheeks. They'd been walking for 6 hours since the wagon wheel had snapped on the trail east of Bitter Creek. 6 hours through country that could kill a grown man in good weather, let alone a woman with 3 children in the worst blizzard Montana territory had seen in a decade. "Just a little farther," Grace lied, because hope was all she had left to give them. She didn't know how much farther they could make it. She wasn't even sure they were still on any kind of trail. The landmarks she'd memorized from Daniel's maps had vanished under the relentless white, leaving them wandering through a world that looked the same in every direction. Daniel. Her husband's name still tasted like betrayal on her tongue. 3 days ago, he'd kissed her goodbye and promised to return from town with supplies before the first snow. Instead, she'd found his note tucked under the sugar tin. "Gone to California. Fresh start. You'll manage. You always do." $20 and a half-empty flour sack. That's what 15 years of marriage had been worth to him. The worst part wasn't the abandonment. It was the timing. Daniel had known the blizzard was coming, had seen the signs in the sky that every frontier family learned to read like scripture. And he'd left anyway, taking their only horse and leaving them stranded at their homestead, with winter closing in like a fist. Grace stumbled, her worn boot catching on something buried beneath the snow. She went down hard, her knees hitting the frozen ground with a crack that sent pain shooting up her spine. For a moment she stayed there gasping, fighting the urge to simply lie down and let the cold take her. "Mama!" Lucy's small voice cut through the wind, sharp with terror. Grace forced herself up. She couldn't quit. Not when Tommy was watching her with eyes too old for his face. Not when Lucy was depending on her to know what to do. Not when Jamie needed her to keep moving forward even when forward felt impossible. That's when she saw it. A light flickering faintly in the distance, half hidden by the curtain of snow and the dark shapes of pine trees. Not starlight, too steady for that. Not wildfire, too controlled. Lamplight. Someone was home. "There," she said, pointing with a shaking hand. "Do you see it?" Tommy squinted through the storm. "Is it friendly, folks?" Grace almost laughed at the question. In 15 years on the frontier, she'd learned that friendly folks were as rare as summer snow. Most people out here minded their own business and expected others to do the same. Some were decent enough to help a neighbor in need. Others might see a woman alone with 3 children as something else entirely. But they were past the luxury of choice now. The temperature was dropping with the sun, and the wind was picking up strength. In another hour, maybe 2, they'd start dropping. First Jamie, then Lucy, then Tommy, and finally her. The Montana wilderness had swallowed whole families for less than what they'd already endured. "Friendly or not," Grace said, gathering what remained of her strength, "we're about to find out." They stumbled the last 100 yards together, Grace half carrying Jamie while Tommy and Lucy held on to her coat. By the time they reached the cabin, Grace's knuckles were too numb to feel the door beneath them. She raised her fist and knocked. Once, twice, 3 times, nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, using the side of her fist. "Please," she called, though her voice came out as little more than a rasp. "Please, we have children." For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind trying to tear the world apart. Then finally she heard it, the scrape of a chair across wooden floors, the heavy thud of boots, the rattle of a door bolt being drawn back. The door opened, and Grace found herself looking up at a man who filled the entire frame. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that hung past his collar and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. His clothes were rough homespun wool and leather, patched but clean, and his hands, God, his hands were enormous. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Dark as winter nights and just as cold, they took in the sight of her and the children with an expression she couldn't read. Not cruel, but not kind either. Just measuring. For a heartbeat, Grace wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. For 3 heartbeats that felt like hours, Cole Ryder stood in his doorway, studying the woman and children before him. He'd learned long ago to read danger in the mountains, wolves, bears, men with ill intentions. But this was something different. This was desperation wearing a woman's face, with 3 pairs of eyes that held the particular emptiness that came just before the cold claimed them. The woman swayed on her feet, one hand pressed against the doorframe to keep herself upright. Her children clustered behind her like frightened quail, steam rising from their small bodies in the frigid air. The oldest boy, maybe 10 years old, had his arms wrapped around the 2 smaller ones, trying to shield them from wind that could strip flesh from bone. Cole had seen enough frozen corpses in his 15 years on the mountain to recognize the signs. Blue lips, that glassy look in the eyes, the way they shivered in sharp, violent bursts instead of the steady trembling of ordinary cold. They had maybe 20 minutes before the smallest one started shutting down. "Get inside," he said, stepping back from the door. "All of you. Now." The woman didn't hesitate. She stumbled across the threshold, half carrying the youngest child while the other 2 pressed close behind her. Cole slammed the door against the wind, dropping the heavy oak bar into place with movements that spoke of long practice. The warmth hit them like a physical blow. All 4 visitors staggered, overwhelmed by the sudden change from the killing cold outside to the blessed heat that radiated from Cole's stone fireplace. The youngest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 5, let out a sob and buried his face in his mother's skirt. "Sit," Cole commanded, pulling chairs closer to the fire. "Strip off anything wet." He moved with the efficient calm of someone accustomed to emergencies. From a chest near the fireplace, he pulled thick woolen blankets that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. While the family huddled near the flames, he disappeared into what appeared to be a small side room, returning with a kettle and several chipped tin cups. "Drink this," he said, ladling steaming liquid into the cups. "It's willow bark tea with honey. Bitter, but it'll warm you from the inside." Grace accepted the cup with trembling hands, wrapping her numb fingers around the blessed warmth. She studied their host while her children sipped the tea with careful, grateful silence. He was a large man, not just tall, but built like someone who'd spent years wrestling with the frontier and winning. His clothes were patched but well made, his cabin rough but scrupulously clean. Everything about him suggested competence, self-sufficiency, and the kind of isolation that came from choice rather than circumstance. "Thank you," she managed, her voice still raw from the wind. "I'm Grace Morgan. These are my children, Tommy, Lucy, and Jamie." Cole nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that didn't commit him to anything beyond basic hospitality. "Cole Ryder, how far did you walk?" "Since morning. Our wagon broke down east of Bitter Creek." Grace's throat tightened as she spoke. No need to mention Daniel yet, or the note, or the $20 that wouldn't last them through winter, even if they'd had somewhere to spend it. "Bitter Creek's 8 miles from here." Cole's voice carried no judgment, but Grace could see him calculating. 8 miles in this weather with 3 children on foot. It should have been impossible. "We didn't have a choice," Tommy said suddenly, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the cabin. His young voice carried an edge of defiance that made Grace's heart ache. "Mama said we had to keep walking or we'd freeze." Cole looked at the boy, really looked at him, taking in the set of his thin shoulders, the way he positioned himself between his mother and a potential threat. "Smart boy. How old are you?" 10, sir. Almost 11. Old enough to know when to fight and when to follow orders." There was something like approval in Cole's voice. "What about you 2? He addressed Lucy and Jamie gently. "You holding up all right?" Lucy nodded shyly, but Jamie surprised them all by speaking up. Are you a mountain man, mister? Cole's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. I suppose I am. You know about mountain men. Mama told us stories about trappers and hunters who live in the woods and fight bears with just a knife. Well, I've never fought a bear with just a knife, Cole said seriously. Bears are smarter than that. They don't fight fair. Jamie giggled, the first sound of childhood joy Grace had heard from any of her children in days. The sound seemed to surprise Cole as much as it did her. As the immediate crisis of warming up passed, Grace began to notice details about the cabin that spoke to its owner's character. The tools were well maintained and properly stored. Books lined a shelf near the window. Not many, but more than most frontier homes could boast. The floor was swept clean, and the oil lamps were filled and trimmed. This was the home of a man who took care of what he had. I don't suppose you're heading toward town anytime soon, Grace said carefully. She needed to know where they stood, what she could hope for. Cole poured himself a cup of tea and settled into a chair across from them. Next supply run's not planned until spring. Trail won't be passable for weeks, maybe months, depending on how long this storm lasts. Grace felt her stomach drop. Months? Could be. This is shaping up to be a hard winter. Saw it coming in the animals. They've been preparing for weeks. Smart enough to listen when the mountain talks. Unlike humans, Grace thought bitterly. Unlike her husband, who'd seen the same signs and chosen to run rather than prepare. We can't stay here that long, she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how foolish they sounded. We need to get to Bozeman. I have a sister there. Cole studied her face in the firelight. You planning to walk to Bozeman with 3 children in weather that'll kill a grown man with good gear and 20 years experience? No, Grace trailed off because she didn't have an answer. She'd been so focused on getting them through each hour of the storm that she hadn't thought beyond survival. But now, sitting in the warmth of this stranger's cabin, reality was settling in like a weight on her chest. Where's your husband? Cole asked quietly. The question she'd been dreading. Grace glanced at her children, who were listening with the sharp attention of youngsters who'd learned that adult conversations often determine their fate. Gone, she said simply. Left 3 days ago. Coming back? Grace met his eyes. No. Cole absorbed this information without visible reaction. In frontier communities, people learn not to pry too deeply into others' troubles. Everyone had stories they'd rather not tell. Well, he said after a moment, looks like you're stuck with me until the thaw. We can't impose, Grace began. You're not imposing, you're surviving. There's a difference. Cole stood and moved to a cabinet near the door. This cabin's seen families before. Built it big enough for a reason. He returned with a wooden box, opening it to reveal salted meat, hard biscuits, and a small jar of what looked like preserves. Supper won't be fancy, but it'll be filling. Tomorrow we'll talk about arrangements, where everyone sleeps, how we divide the work, what rules we follow. Rules? Tommy asked. Every household has rules, boy. Especially when it's winter and we're all trapped together until spring. But that's tomorrow's conversation. Cole began slicing the salted meat with practiced efficiency. Tonight we just focus on staying warm and fed. As if summoned by the mention of food, Grace's stomach growled audibly. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. Yesterday morning maybe, before they'd started the journey that was supposed to end with family and Helena, but had instead led them here. Can I help? She asked, starting to rise. Sit, Cole said firmly. You've done enough for one day. Tomorrow you can start earning your keep, but tonight your guess. Grace wanted to argue. She'd been taking care of herself and her children since she was 14 years old, and accepting charity had never come easily. But exhaustion was pulling at her like an undertow, and Jamie was already falling asleep, curled against her side. Thank you, she said quietly, for the shelter, the warmth, the food. I know you don't owe us anything. Cole paused in his food preparation, his knife still for a moment. Mountain's got its own rules about hospitality, he said without looking at her. You don't turn away people who'll die without help. Simple as that. Even strangers? Especially strangers. Neighbors look out for each other because they know each other. Strangers, Well, strangers are just neighbors you haven't met yet. As Cole continued preparing their meal, Grace found herself studying him more carefully. He moved with the confidence of someone completely at home in his environment, but there was something else there too. A carefulness in how he spoke to the children, a gentleness in how he'd wrap the blankets around them. This wasn't a man who was used to having people in his space, but he was adapting to it with surprising grace. Outside, the wind continued to howl against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters and seeking every crack and crevice. But inside, with the fire crackling and the promise of food warming Grace's empty stomach, she allowed herself to hope that they might actually survive this. She just had to figure out what came next, and whether the man who'd saved them would still want them around when the immediate crisis had passed and they became a burden rather than refugees. Tomorrow would bring those conversations. Tonight, she would simply be grateful that her children were warm, fed, and safe. For the first time in 3 days, that felt like enough. The first night in Cole Ryder's cabin passed in fitful sleep and whispered fears. Grace had positioned herself between her children and the door. Old habits died hard, even in sanctuary. She dozed in brief intervals, jerking awake each time the wind rattled the shutters or a log settled in the fireplace. Across the room, Cole slept in a chair by the fire, his rifle resting against his knee. Even in sleep, he maintained the alertness of a man who'd survived 15 winters alone on the mountain. Tommy was the first to wake as pale morning light filtered through the cabin's single window. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Lucy and Jamie, who were curled together beneath one of Cole's heavy woolen blankets. "Morning," Cole said quietly, already feeding fresh logs to the fire. "Sleep at all?" Tommy straightened his shoulders. That automatic response Grace recognized, her eldest trying to be the man of the family. "Yes, sir. Thank you for the blanket." "Storm's still howling," Cole observed, jerking his chin toward the window where snow continued to swirl in thick curtains. "Looks like we're all staying put for another day at least." Grace stirred at the sound of voices. "Is everyone all right?" "We're fine, Mama," Tommy assured her, though his voice carried that careful tone he'd adopted since Daniel left. The voice of a child shouldering burdens too heavy for his years. Cole moved to the window, peering out at the white wilderness. "Haven't seen a storm this fierce since '73. That one lasted 11 days. 11 days, Grace's voice caught. She'd been hoping they could move on quickly before becoming too much of an imposition. "Could be longer. Mountain decides these things, not us." Cole turned back to them. "Point is, we'd better figure out how to live together for a while." Jamie woke up then, blinking owlish eyes. "Mama? Where are we?" "We're with Mr. Ryder, remember? The mountain man who helped us." Jamie's face brightened with 5-year-old resilience. "Are we staying? Can we see the bears?" "No bears this time of year," Cole said seriously, addressing the child as if his questions mattered. "They're all sleeping until spring, but there might be other things to see if the storm passes." As Cole prepared breakfast, cornmeal mush and preserved fruit, Grace studied the cabin more carefully in the morning light. It was larger than she'd initially realized, with a sleeping loft accessible by ladder. The main room felt spacious rather than cramped, designed by someone who understood the importance of not feeling trapped during long winters. "This is a beautiful home," she said. "Did you build it yourself?" Cole nodded, stirring the cornmeal. "Took 2 summers. Had help with the roof, but most of it's my work." "You've lived here long?" 15 years this spring. Came up after I decided I needed space between me and civilization." Grace heard the weight behind those words, the suggestion of a story he wasn't ready to tell. Everyone who ended up on the frontier had reasons for leaving what they'd known behind. "Don't you get lonely?" Tommy asked with a child's directness. The question seemed to catch Cole off guard. He was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted finally, "but lonely's better than being around the wrong people." Grace felt something twist in her chest at his words. How many times had she felt exactly the same way, especially in the months before Daniel left? "Mama says being alone is different from being lonely," Lucy offered quietly. "She says alone can be peaceful, but lonely hurts." Cole's hands stilled. "Your mama's a wise woman." As they ate breakfast, Grace watched the interactions between Cole and her children. He spoke to them as individuals, listening to their questions and answering seriously. When Tommy asked about hunting, Cole explained the difference between survival and sport. When Lucy wondered about his books, he told her she was welcome to look at them. When Jamie asked to help with chores, Cole suggested the boy could stack firewood. It struck Grace that Cole treated her children better in one morning than Daniel had in the final year of their marriage. "I should help with something," Grace said, rising from the table. "I'm not accustomed to sitting idle." "Can you sew?" Cole asked. "Yes, quite well." Cole gestured toward a basket overflowing with clothes needing repair. "Winter's hard on fabric. Been putting off mending since fall." Grace examined the contents: shirts and pants with torn seams, worn patches, missing buttons. The work of a competent man who'd never learned the finer points of needle and thread. "I can handle these." As Grace settled into the work, her children found their own ways to contribute. Tommy helped Cole organize firewood. Lucy began teaching Jamie his letters on a slate board she discovered. The sound filled the cabin with domestic warmth that felt both foreign and familiar. By midday, the storm had intensified. Wind drove snow against the windows with such force that the glass rattled. The cabin groaned but held firm, testament to Cole's building skills. "Good thing we're not still out there," Tommy observed. "Good thing you had the sense to keep walking when things got tough," Cole replied. "Takes courage to walk into a blizzard with 3 children." "Desperation, more like," Grace said without bitterness. "Always have choices," Cole disagreed. "They're just not always good ones. You chose to fight for your children instead of giving up. That matters." The conversation was interrupted by a violent gust that tore one of the shutters loose. It banged against the wall with sharp, rhythmic impacts. "I'll fix that," Cole said, reaching for his coat. "In this weather?" Grace asked, alarmed. "Shutter bangs loose. It'll tear the whole wall apart." Cole bundled himself in layers: coat, hat, gloves, scarf wrapped until only his eyes showed. When he opened the door, wind tried to tear it from his hands. Snow swirled into the cabin, dropping the temperature 10 degrees instantly. "Bar the door behind me," Cole instructed. "Don't open it unless you hear me call your name." Grace did as he said, pressing her back against the door. Through the walls, she could hear Cole working: hammer on nail, wood on wood, metal scraping against logs. The work seemed to take forever, each minute stretching as Grace imagined him lost in the white fury outside. Finally, she heard his voice. "Grace! It's Cole! Open up!" She lifted the bar. Cole stumbled inside, more ice than man, his beard white with frost, hands so cold he could barely move them. Grace helped him shed his frozen layers while the children watched with worried eyes. "Shutters secure," Cole managed through chattering teeth. Grace guided him to the fire, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. His hands were blue-white, and she began rubbing them gently, trying to restore circulation. "Thank you," she said softly, "for risking yourself for our safety." Cole looked down at her hands working over his, her touch gentle but firm. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Part of maintaining the cabin," he said gruffly. "No," Grace replied firmly. "This was about protecting us. I know the difference." Their eyes met in the firelight, and for a moment, something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond gratitude and hospitality. Grace felt her pulse quicken, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Mama," Tommy said quietly, breaking the spell. "Mr. Ryder's hands are getting pink again." Grace looked down to find Cole's circulation returning. She released his hands and stepped back, suddenly aware of how intimate the moment had become. The rest of the day passed in quiet domesticity. Grace continued her sewing while Cole taught Tommy about firewood. Lucy read aloud from one of Cole's books, while Jamie listened with rapt attention. The storm continued outside, but inside something like contentment settled over them. As evening approached, Cole began supper preparations: beans and salt pork with fresh biscuits. Grace tried to help, but found herself relegated to setting the table. "You don't have to do everything yourself," she pointed out. "This is my kitchen," Cole replied. "Tomorrow, if we're still here, you can take over cooking if you want. Tonight, you're still guests." "We can't be guests forever," Grace said quietly. "If this storm lasts as long as you think, we need a better arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "Partnership," Grace said firmly. sharing the work, sharing responsibilities. I won't be a burden, and I won't have my children thinking it's acceptable to take without giving back. And if I prefer things my way, Grace met his eyes directly, then we'll find somewhere else to go once the storm passes. Cole studied her face, seeing something that seemed to satisfy him. Partnership, then, starting tomorrow. As they ate supper by lamplight, Tommy asked, Mr. Ryder, what made you decide to live up here by yourself? Cole set down his fork thoughtfully. Sometimes a man needs to figure out who he is when nobody else is watching. Up here, the only opinions that matter are yours and the mountains. People whispered about us in town, Jamie said matter-of-factly. Grace's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but Cole responded gently. People whisper when they're scared. Your papa leaving scared other folks because it made them think about what they'd do if their own families fell apart. Easier to whisper than admit they might not handle things as well as your mama did. Grace stared at him, stunned by his insight. In a few sentences, he'd articulated something she'd struggled to understand for months. Mama's stronger than most folks, Tommy said proudly. Takes a special kind of courage to hold a family together when everything's falling apart. Cole agreed, looking directly at Grace. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but relief. To have her strength recognized rather than dismissed meant more than she could say. As the evening wound down, Grace tucked her children into their makeshift beds near the hearth. Lucy fell asleep clutching one of Cole's books. Jamie curled up with a wooden horse Cole had carved during the afternoon. Mama, Tommy whispered, do you think we'll stay here? I don't know, sweetheart. That depends on a lot of things. I like it here. Mr. Ryder doesn't treat us like we're broken. Grace kissed her son's forehead and settled into her own blankets. Outside, the storm continued, but inside something was building. Fragile still, but real. A sense of possibility that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Across the cabin, Cole stared into the dying fire and wondered what he was getting himself into. 15 years of solitude, and now his cabin was full of family sounds, complications, expectations. He should have been planning how to get them safely to town once the storm passed. Instead, he found himself hoping the storm would last a little longer. Just long enough to figure out whether the feelings stirring in his chest were worth the risk of changing everything. The fire settled with a shower of sparks, and Cole finally allowed himself to sleep, listening to the gentle breathing of the family that had somehow made his cabin feel like home. A week into their partnership, Grace woke to silence. Not the comfortable quiet of family sleeping, but the ominous absence of wind. The storm that had raged for nearly a week had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. Cole was already at the window, studying the crystalline landscape that stretched endlessly toward distant peaks. It's over, he said without turning around. Trails should be passable in a day or two, once the drifts settle. Grace felt an unexpected pang at his words. She should have been relieved. The storm's end meant they were no longer trapped, no longer entirely dependent on Cole's hospitality. Instead, she felt something like loss, as if the approaching possibility of leaving had stolen something precious from the warm cocoon they'd built inside these log walls. That's good news, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Cole turned to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable. Is it? Before Grace could answer, Tommy bounded down from the loft where he'd been sleeping since the second night. Mr. Ryder, can we go outside today? I want to see how deep the snow is. After breakfast, Cole promised. But you'll need to stay close to the cabin. Snow's deceptive. Looks solid, but there could be hidden drops underneath. As they prepared for their first venture outside since the storm began, Grace found herself watching Cole with new attention. Over the past 5 days, she'd seen him transform from a wary stranger into something approaching family. He'd taught Tommy how to carve, shown Lucy basic reading in his collection of books, and patiently answered Jamie's endless questions about mountain life. More than that, he'd included Grace in decisions about daily routines, asked her opinions on everything from meal planning to cabin maintenance, treated her as an equal partner rather than a grateful dependent. The outside world was a wonderland of white silence. Snow had drifted against the cabin's north wall to nearly window height, while the south side remained relatively clear thanks to the overhanging roof. The children tumbled into the snow with delighted shrieks, their voices the first sounds to break the mountain's peace in days. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, standing beside Cole on the cleared porch. "Beautiful and deadly," Cole agreed. "Couple more days of this weather, and we might have been in real trouble with supplies." Grace was about to respond when she caught sight of movement on the distant trail, a dark speck against the white that gradually resolved into a man on horseback, leading a pack animal behind him. Her breath caught in her throat as recognition dawned. "Cole," she whispered, her voice tight with sudden fear. He followed her gaze and immediately stepped closer, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. "You know him? It's Daniel." The name felt like poison on her tongue. "My husband." Cole's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Children, inside, now." "But Mr. Ryder," Tommy began. "Now," Cole repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "Grace, get them inside and keep them there until I say otherwise." Grace herded her children into the cabin, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rage. Through the window, she watched Daniel ride into the yard with the casual confidence of a man who expected to be welcomed. He looked well-fed, well-dressed, entirely unaffected by the hardships his family had endured in his absence. Cole stood on the porch, rifle held casually but visibly, as Daniel dismounted and approached. Even through the cabin walls, Grace could hear their voices. "Afternoon," Daniel called, his tone friendly but wary. "Name's Daniel Morgan. I'm looking for my wife and children." "That's so." Cole's response was flat, noncommittal. "Had word they might have come this way during the storm. Woman named Grace, 3 young ones." "You seen them?" Grace pressed closer to the window, her children clustered behind her. Tommy's small hand found hers, squeezing tight. "Might have," Cole said carefully. "Question is, what's a husband doing looking for his family instead of protecting them from the storm in the first place?" Daniel's friendly mask slipped slightly. "That's between me and my wife, friend. Now, are they here or not?" "They're here." Cole stepped down from the porch, positioning himself between Daniel and the cabin door. "Question is whether they want to see you." "Want to see me?" Daniel's voice rose with indignation. "I'm their father, their husband. What they want doesn't enter into it." Grace felt her resolve crystallize. She'd been dreading this moment for days, but now that it was here, she found herself filled not with fear, but with fury. How dare he show up now, after abandoning them to face winter alone? How dare he speak of ownership when he'd forfeited any claim to her loyalty the moment he chose his own comfort over their survival? She opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch, her children close behind her. "Hello, Daniel." Her husband's face brightened with relief and what might have been genuine happiness. "Grace, thank God you're safe. I've been worried sick." "Have you?" Grace's voice was ice. "Worried enough to come back sooner? Worried enough to face the storm with us?" Daniel's expression shifted, becoming placating, manipulative, the face she remembered from countless arguments. "Now, Grace, I know you're upset, but if you'll just let me explain." "Explain what? The note you left? The $20? The fact that you knew the storm was coming and chose to run rather than help your family prepare for it?" "I was going to send for you once I got established in California. It was always the plan." "Liar." The word cracked like a whip. "If that was the plan, you would have discussed it with me. You would have made arrangements. You would have left more than $20 in a half-empty flour sack." Daniel's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You're making a scene, Grace. These are private family matters." "Private?" Grace stepped closer to the porch edge, her voice rising. "You made our business public the moment you abandoned us to gossip and speculation. You made it public when you left us to face winter alone. I came back, didn't I? I'm here now, ready to take responsibility." "You came back because California didn't work out," Grace interrupted. "You came back because wherever you went, whoever you tried to become, it didn't give you what you expected. So now you want to reclaim what you threw away." Daniel's mask slipped entirely, revealing the petulant, selfish man beneath. "You're my wife, Grace. They're my children. You belong with me." "No." Grace's voice was quiet now, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. I belonged with the man I married 15 years ago. That man would never have left his family to face a Montana winter alone. You're someone else now? Someone I don't know and don't trust. You can't keep my children from me, Daniel snarled, his hand moving toward the gun on his hip. Cole's rifle came up smoothly, the barrel pointed directly at Daniel's chest. Actually, she can. Matter of fact, I'd recommend you climb back on that horse and ride out before this conversation takes a turn you won't like. Daniel looked between Cole and Grace, his face working with frustrated rage. You don't understand, Mountain Man. These are legal matters. I have rights. So do they, Cole interrupted. Right to safety, right to choose who they trust, right to live without fear. Far as I can see, you gave up your rights when you chose to run. This isn't over, Daniel said, swinging back into his saddle with violent motions. I'll be back with the law, with papers. We'll see what a judge thinks about a wife who runs off with another man while her husband's trying to make a better life for his family. Grace felt her stomach drop. She'd been so focused on the moral arguments, the emotional betrayal, that she hadn't considered the legal realities. In the eyes of the law, Daniel was still her husband, still the children's father. His abandonment might be morally reprehensible, but it wouldn't necessarily void his legal claims. Let him come, Cole said quietly, lowering his rifle as Daniel rode away. When he does, he'll find out what the community thinks of men who abandon their families. Grace turned to look at him, surprised by the confidence in his voice. What do you mean? I mean, you're not as alone as you think, Grace. People around here have their own ideas about right and wrong, and they don't always match up with what's written in law books. Inside the cabin, Grace sank into a chair while her children clustered around her. Tommy's face was pale but determined. Lucy looked frightened but resolute, and Jamie seemed confused by the adult tension swirling around him. Is Papa taking us away? Jamie asked in a small voice. Not if I can help it, Grace said firmly, pulling him onto her lap. But we need to be prepared for him to try. I don't want to go with him, Lucy said quietly. I want to stay here with Mr. Ryder. Me too, Tommy added. Papa left us. Mr. Ryder saved us. Grace felt tears prick her eyes at her children's simple, clear assessment of the situation. In their minds, the choice was obvious. Stay with the man who'd protected them, fed them, treated them with kindness and respect, or go with the one who'd abandoned them when they needed him most. If only the law saw things as clearly as children did. Cole knelt beside her chair, his large hand gentle on her shoulder. We'll figure this out, Grace. Whatever comes next, you don't have to face it alone. Grace looked into his eyes and saw something that made her breath catch. Not just determination to protect them, but something deeper, more personal. When had this become about more than simple hospitality? When had Cole Ryder decided that her battles were his battles, her future his concern? Why, she whispered, why are you willing to fight for us? Cole was quiet for a long moment, his hand still warm on her shoulder. Because in 5 days you and these children have made this place feel more like home than it has in 15 years, he said simply. Because I'd rather fight alongside you than go back to being alone. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not the violent blizzard that had trapped them together, but gentle flakes that caught the afternoon light like tiny diamonds. Grace watched through the window and realized that Daniel's return had changed everything and nothing. The storm that had brought them here was over, but another kind of weather was moving in. The question was whether they'd be strong enough to weather it together. What do we do now? Tommy asked. Grace looked around at the 3 small faces, depending on her, for answers. At the man who'd somehow become essential to their survival. At the cabin that had sheltered them through the worst storm in a decade. Now we prepare, she said quietly, and we hope that when the real test comes, we're ready for it. Because one thing was certain, Daniel would be back, and next time, he wouldn't be alone. 3 days after Daniel's visit, Cole returned from his supply run to Pine Ridge with news that made Grace's blood run cold. He'd barely unsaddled his horse before delivering the blow that would change everything. He's got papers, Cole said without preamble, his face grim as Winterstone. Custody order signed by Judge Harrison in Helena. Sheriff Mackenzie's riding up tomorrow morning with 2 deputies. Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She'd known this moment would come, had tried to prepare herself for it, but the reality hit her like a physical blow. When? Dawn, most likely. Daniel's smart enough to know that catching us before we're fully awake gives him the advantage. Grace sank onto the porch step, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Inside the cabin, she could hear her children playing. Tommy teaching Jamie a card game, while Lucy read aloud from one of Cole's adventure books. The sounds of innocence, of childhood protected and nurtured. Tomorrow that might all be torn away. "What did people in town say?" she asked quietly. Cole's expression softened slightly. "More than you might expect. Martha Henley runs the boarding house. She said any man who abandons his family in winter has no right to reclaim them when spring comes. Doc Peterson agrees. Even Reverend Walsh, who's usually all about the sanctity of marriage, seems to think Daniel forfeited his moral authority. But moral authority isn't legal authority," Grace said bitterly. "No," Cole admitted, "but it counts for something. Sheriff Mackenzie's a decent man. He won't enjoy this duty, especially not with half the town thinking Daniel's in the wrong." Grace looked up at Cole, this man who'd become so much more than a rescuer, so much more than a temporary shelter from the storm. "You should let us go," she said quietly. "Don't fight this battle. You've done enough." Cole's jaw tightened. "That's not your decision to make." "It is, actually. This is my fight, my mistake, my—" "Your what?" Cole interrupted, his voice sharp with controlled anger. "Your fault that your husband abandoned you? Your fault that he chose his own comfort over his family's survival? Your fault that he's now trying to use the law to cover up his own cowardice?" "My fault for dragging you into it," Grace finished quietly. Cole knelt in front of her, his large hands gentle as they covered hers. "Grace, look at me." When she met his eyes, he continued with quiet intensity. "You didn't drag me into anything. I chose this. I'm choosing this. Every day I wake up in that cabin and see your children happy and safe. Every time I watch you mend clothes or prepare meals or tell stories by the fire, I choose this life over the one I had before." Grace felt tears threaten, but forced them back. She couldn't afford to break down now, not when her children needed her to be strong. What if we lose? What if the law doesn't care about moral authority or community opinion? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Grace, ... Cole's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I need you to know something before tomorrow comes. These past weeks, having you and the children here, it's shown me what I've been missing all these years alone on the mountain. I'm not just fighting for your right to choose your own life. I'm fighting for the chance to build a life with you." Grace's breath caught. She'd sensed the growing connection between them, had felt her own heart responding to his quiet strength and gentle kindness. But hearing him speak it aloud made it real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Cole, I know it's complicated," he said quickly. "I know the timing is terrible. But if we're facing this battle tomorrow, I wanted you to know where I stand. Not just as someone who took you in during a storm, but as a man who's fallen in love with your strength, your courage, the way you've never stopped fighting for your children." Before Grace could respond, the cabin door opened and Tommy stepped onto the porch. "Mama, is everything all right? You look upset." Grace quickly wiped her eyes and forced a smile. "Just tired, sweetheart. Mr. Ryder was telling me about his trip to town." Tommy's perceptive gaze moved between the two adults, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. "Is Papa coming back?" Grace exchanged a look with Cole, who nodded slightly, a silent agreement to tell the children the truth. "Yes," she said simply. "Tomorrow morning, with the sheriff." Tommy's face went pale but determined. "Are they going to make us go with him?" "They're going to try," Grace admitted, "but we're not going without a fight." "Good," Tommy said with fierce conviction, "because I don't want to go anywhere with him. None of us do." That evening, as Grace tucked her children into their beds near the fireplace, she tried to find words that would prepare them for what might come without destroying their sense of security. "No matter what happens tomorrow," she told them, "remember that you are loved. Remember that the choices you make about who to trust, who to care about, who to call family, those choices matter. They define who you are. Are you scared, Mama? Lucy asked quietly. Grace considered lying, giving her daughter false comfort. Instead, she chose honesty. Yes, I'm scared, but being scared doesn't mean giving up. Sometimes the most important things we do are the things that scare us most. Mr. Ryder's scared too, Jamie observed with 5-year-old directness. But he's still going to fight for us. Grace glanced toward the kitchen where Cole was cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. Yes, she said softly. He is. Because he loves us, Lucy added matter-of-factly. Grace's throat tightened. Yes, sweetheart, because he loves us. Later, after the children had fallen asleep, Grace and Cole sat together by the dying fire. The cabin felt smaller somehow, as if the approaching confrontation had already begun to compress their world. What will you do if they take us? Grace asked quietly. Cole was silent for a long moment. Follow, he said finally. Make sure you're safe. Make sure Daniel treats you the way you deserve to be treated. And if he doesn't? Cole's hand stilled on the rifle stock. Then I'll remind him that some things matter more than what's written in law books. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Cole, you can't. Violence won't solve this. It'll only make things worse. Won't be violence unless he makes it violence, Cole replied calmly. But I won't stand by and watch him hurt you or the children. Not now, not ever. Grace reached out and covered his hands with hers, stilling his restless movements. Promise me something. Promise me that whatever happens tomorrow, you won't do anything that will take you away from us permanently. Because if we're going to build something together, we need you alive and free to do it. Cole turned his hands palm up, intertwining their fingers. I promise, but you have to promise me something too. What? Promise me you won't give up. Whatever Daniel says, whatever legal papers he waves around, whatever threats he makes, promise me you'll keep fighting for what you want. Not just what seems easiest. Grace looked into his eyes, seeing not just determination, but hope. Hope for a future that seemed impossible, but felt more real than anything she'd ever wanted. I promise. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the fire burn down to coals. Outside, the mountain held its breath, waiting for dawn and the reckoning it would bring. Grace found herself thinking about the woman she'd been just 3 weeks ago. Desperate, abandoned, walking through a blizzard with no clear destination and no real plan beyond keeping her children alive. That woman had been focused purely on survival, on making it through each day without breaking. The woman she was now wanted more than survival. She wanted love, partnership, a home built on choice rather than obligation. She wanted her children to grow up seeing what healthy relationships look like, what it meant when two people chose each other every day, rather than simply enduring each other. She wanted Cole Ryder's quiet strength, his gentle hands, his way of listening to her children as if their thoughts mattered. She wanted mornings filled with the sound of his axe splitting wood and evenings spent by the fire sharing stories and dreams. Most of all, she wanted the right to choose her own life, to decide for herself what happiness looked like and who deserved a place in it. Tomorrow, Daniel would come with his papers and his legal claims and his assumption that ownership trumped love. He would expect her to submit, to fall back into the role of dutiful wife, despite his abandonment, despite his cruelty, despite everything he'd put them through. He was going to be disappointed. Grace squeezed Cole's hands once more, then rose and moved to the window. Outside, stars glittered like ice crystals against the velvet sky, cold and distant and beautiful. Somewhere in that darkness, Daniel was probably planning his triumphant return, rehearsing the words he'd use to reclaim what he thought belonged to him. Let him come. Let him bring his sheriff and his papers and his legal righteousness. He would find them ready, not just to resist, but to fight for something better than anything he could offer. The mountain had taught her many things during these weeks of shelter and healing. But perhaps the most important lesson was this. Sometimes the storm that seems like it will destroy you is actually clearing the way for something stronger to grow. Tomorrow's reckoning would determine whether that something was strong enough to survive in the harsh light of day. Dawn came pale and cold, bringing with it the sound Grace had been dreading, the steady rhythm of horses climbing the mountain trail. She stood at the cabin window, Cole's rifle in her hands, watching as four riders emerged from the morning mist like harbingers of judgment. Sheriff Mackenzie rode in front, his badge catching the early light, his weathered face set in lines of reluctant duty. Behind him came his two deputies, young men who looked uncomfortable with their mission, and beside them, straight-backed and radiating righteous satisfaction, rode Daniel Morgan. "They're here," Grace called softly. Cole appeared beside her, his own weapon ready, but held low. "Remember what we discussed. Let me do the talking until we know exactly what we're dealing with." Grace nodded, though her hands trembled slightly on the rifle stock. Behind them, the children huddled together near the fireplace. Tommy trying to look brave, Lucy clutching her favorite book. Jamie pressed close to his siblings with wide, fearful eyes. The riders stopped 20 yards from the cabin. Sheriff Mackenzie dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. He was a man who'd seen enough violence to prefer avoiding it when possible. "Morning, Rider," he called, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "Got some business to attend to. Hope we can handle it peaceful-like." Cole stepped onto the porch, Grace close behind him. "Sheriff, always welcome here, you know that. But I can't say the same for all your companions." Daniel swung down from his horse with theatrical confidence. "Sheriff Mackenzie has a legal order, Rider. You're harboring my wife and children against their will." "Against their will?" Grace stepped forward, her voice cutting through the cold air like a blade. "The only thing done against our will was being abandoned in the middle of winter with $20 and a broken wagon." Sheriff Mackenzie held up a weathered hand. "Mrs. Morgan, I understand your feelings, but I've got papers here signed by Judge Harrison. Court says the children belong with their father." "Even when their father left them to die?" Cole asked quietly. "That's not how the law sees it," Mackenzie replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the law's position. "Far as the court's concerned, Mr. Morgan here was establishing residence in California to provide better opportunities for his family." Daniel stepped forward, puffing with self-importance. "That's exactly right. I was working to build a better life for all of us. Grace was supposed to wait for word from me, not run off with the first man who—" "Careful," Cole interrupted, his voice carrying a warning that made both deputies shift nervously in their saddles. "Real careful how you finish that sentence." Sheriff Mackenzie stepped between them. "Let's keep this civil, gentlemen. Mrs. Morgan, I need you to gather your children and your things. Court order says they're to be remanded to their father's custody immediately." "No." Grace's voice was steady, absolute. "I won't do it." "Ma'am, you don't have a choice in the matter." "Everyone has a choice, Sheriff." The new voice came from the trail below, where a line of riders was emerging from the forest. Grace's heart leaped as she recognized them. Neighbors from Pine Ridge, people she'd met during Cole's supply runs, faces that had shown kindness when kindness was rare. Martha Henley rode at the front, her spine straight as a fence post despite her 60-odd years. Behind her came Doc Peterson, Reverend Walsh, the blacksmith Tom Crawford, and a dozen others. They formed a quiet semicircle around the law enforcement party, saying nothing but making their presence felt. "Morning, Sheriff," Martha called pleasantly. "Lovely day for a ride, isn't it?" Mackenzie's jaw tightened. He was experienced enough to recognize the signs of a community taking sides. "This is official business, Martha. Best you folks head on back to town." "Oh, we're not interfering with official business," Martha replied with deceptive sweetness. "We're just here to witness it. Make sure everything's done proper and legal." Daniel's face flushed red. "This is harassment. Sheriff, arrest these people for interfering with a court order." "They're not interfering," Mackenzie said slowly. "They're just observing." Doc Peterson urged his horse forward slightly. "Sheriff, I've been thinking about this situation, and I've got some concerns from a medical standpoint." "What kind of concerns?" "Well, these children survived a terrible ordeal, abandoned in winter, nearly froze to death walking through a blizzard. That kind of trauma leaves marks, mental and physical, separating them from the person who saved them, forcing them back into the care of the person who abandoned them." Doc shook his head gravely. "Could do serious damage to their health and well-being." "That's not a legal argument," Daniel snapped. "No," Reverend Walsh said quietly, "but it's a moral one. Whoso shall receive one such little child in my name receiveth me. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck. Are you calling me an offense to children? Daniel demanded. I'm saying that abandoning your family in winter speaks to your character, Mr. Morgan. And character matters when we're talking about children's welfare. Sheriff Mackenzie looked around at the faces surrounding him. Not hostile, not threatening, but united in their disapproval of his mission. These were the people who elected him, the community he served. Their opinion carried weight that went beyond legal technicalities. Mrs. Morgan, he said finally, the children. I need to hear from them directly. What do they want? Grace looked back toward the cabin where her 3 children stood in the doorway, holding hands, supporting each other. Tell the sheriff what you want, children. Tell him the truth. Tommy stepped forward, his young voice clear and strong. We want to stay with Mom and Mr. Ryder. Papa left us. He didn't care if we lived or died. Mr. Ryder saved us. He takes care of us, Lucy added quietly. He listens to us. He's kind. Papa was mean, Jamie said with 5-year-old honesty. He yelled at Mama and made her cry. Mr. Ryder makes her smile. Daniel's face contorted with rage and embarrassment. They're children. They don't understand the complexities of adult decisions. I have legal rights. You had responsibilities too, Martha Henley said sharply. Responsibilities you walked away from when the going got tough. The law, Daniel began. The law, Doc Peterson interrupted, recognizes extenuating circumstances. Abandonment is grounds for voiding custody rights in most territories. Sheriff Mackenzie rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Grace could see the conflict in his eyes. Duty to the letter of the law warring with his sense of justice and community pressure. Mr. Morgan, he said finally, I think we need to have a private conversation. He drew Daniel aside, speaking in low, urgent tones. Grace couldn't hear the words, but she could see Daniel's face growing redder, his gestures more agitated. Finally, he jerked away from the sheriff and stalked back toward his horse. This isn't over, he snarled at Grace. I'll appeal this. I'll go to the territorial governor if I have to. They're my children, and I'll have them back. Maybe, Cole said quietly, stepping down from the porch. But not today, and maybe not ever, if you keep proving that you care more about ownership than about their happiness. Daniel mounted his horse with violent jerks, his face twisted with frustrated rage. You think you've won something here, Mountain Man? You think playing house with my wife makes you their father? We'll see what higher courts think about that. He wheeled his horse around and galloped down the trail, leaving Sheriff Mackenzie and his deputies looking uncomfortable and uncertain. Sheriff, Grace said quietly, what did you tell him? Mackenzie sighed heavily. Told him that enforcing court orders gets a lot harder when the whole community's watching and the children are old enough to express their own wishes. Told him he might want to consider whether dragging this through higher courts is worth the cost, financial and otherwise. And he'll probably try anyway, but that'll take time, and a lot can happen while lawyers are arguing. Mackenzie looked directly at Grace. Of course, if certain legal situations were to change in the meantime, if, say, you were to become Mrs. Ryder instead of Mrs. Morgan, well, that might complicate his custody claims considerably. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Cole stepped beside her, his large hand finding hers. Sheriff's got a point, Cole said quietly. Question is whether that's something you'd want. Grace looked around at the faces surrounding her, neighbors who'd ridden up a mountain to stand witness for justice, children who'd made their loyalty clear, a man who'd risked everything to protect them. 3 weeks ago, she'd been walking through a blizzard with no destination and no hope. Now she stood at the center of a community, part of something larger than survival. Yes, she said simply, it's something I'd want very much. Cole's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Martha, he called to the older woman, you know anyone who performs wedding ceremonies? Reverend Walsh urged his horse forward with a grin. I believe I'm qualified for that particular duty. As the community began to buzz with excitement, as plans were made and congratulations offered, Grace found herself looking down the trail where Daniel had disappeared. He would be back, she was certain of that. But when he returned, he would find not a vulnerable woman and her children, but a family protected by law, by love, and by a community that had chosen to stand with them. The reckoning had come, and they had not just survived it, they had triumphed. The real test, Grace knew, was just beginning. But as she stood surrounded by people who had chosen to fight for her right to choose her own happiness, she felt ready for whatever came next. They were home. They were family. And no legal paper in the world could change that. 3 weeks after Sheriff Mackenzie's visit, Grace woke to the sound of her children's laughter echoing from the cabin's main room. The sound had become as natural as breathing. Tommy teaching Jamie how to whittle, Lucy reading stories aloud, all three of them chattering excitedly about the wedding that would take place in 2 days' time. Cole had ridden to Pine Ridge the day before to finalize arrangements with Reverend Walsh, and the entire community was buzzing with excitement about what many were calling the wedding of the decade. Not for its grandeur, frontier ceremonies were necessarily simple affairs, but for what it represented: a woman's right to choose her own happiness, a family's triumph over legal manipulation, love conquering not just adversity, but bureaucracy itself. Grace stretched luxuriously in the narrow bed Cole had built for her in the cabin's small side room, savoring these last few mornings as Grace Morgan. In 2 days, she would become Grace Ryder, and with that name would come not just love and partnership, but legal protection that no court order could easily override. She was pinning her hair up when she heard it, the sound that had haunted her nightmares for weeks. Hoofbeats on the mountain trail, approaching fast and hard. But this time, there was only one rider. Grace moved to the window and felt her blood turn to ice. Daniel sat his horse at the edge of the clearing, but he was not the defeated man who'd ridden away 3 weeks ago. This Daniel radiated dangerous confidence, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip, his smile cold and predatory. "Grace," he called, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "Come out here. We need to talk." Cole appeared from the barn, rifle in hand but held low. "You're trespassing, Morgan. Sheriff made that clear last time." "Sheriff's not here now," Daniel replied pleasantly, "and I've got news that changes everything." Grace stepped out onto the porch, her children clustering behind her. Something in Daniel's manner set every instinct screaming with alarm. This wasn't the frustrated, blustering man who'd been turned away by community pressure. This was something colder, more calculated. "What new?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Daniel's smile widened. "Judge Harrison's been removed from the bench. Corruption charges. Seems he was taking bribes to influence custody decisions. All his rulings are being reviewed, including the one that gave me custody of my children." Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "What does that mean?" "It means," Daniel said with obvious satisfaction, "that the legal limbo you've been hiding in is over. New judge, fresh hearing, proper legal representation. And I've been assured that Judge Crawford takes a very dim view of women who abandon their husbands to live in sin with other men." "We're getting married in 2 days," Grace said desperately. "Are you? Because I've also been assured that any marriage performed while custody issues are pending could be viewed as an attempt to circumvent the legal process. Might be grounds for annulment." Cole stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "You threatening my family, Morgan?" "Not threatening," Daniel replied smoothly. "Just explaining legal realities. Grace, you've had your fun playing house with your mountain man. Time to come home and face your responsibilities." "My responsibilities," Grace's voice shook with rage. "You abandoned us in winter. You left your children to face starvation and freezing. What responsibilities do I owe to a man who put his own comfort above his family's survival?" "Legal responsibilities," Daniel snapped, his mask slipping. "You're still my wife, they're still my children, and the law still recognizes my rights as head of this family." "The law," said a new voice from the trail, "recognizes many things." Grace's heart leaped as she saw Martha Henley riding into the clearing, followed by Doc Peterson, Reverend Walsh, and a dozen other neighbors. But they weren't alone. Behind them rode a man Grace didn't recognize. Tall, distinguished, wearing the badge of a territorial marshal. "Marshal Kane," the stranger said, dismounting with practiced ease. "I understand there's some confusion about legal proceedings here." Daniel's confidence faltered slightly. "Marshal, this is a private family matter. Nothing private about threatening women and children." Kane interrupted mildly. Mrs. Henley here sent word about some irregularities in recent custody decisions. Seems Judge Harrison wasn't the only corrupt official in this territory. What kind of irregularities? Grace asked, hope beginning to bloom in her chest. Well, Kane said, pulling a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag, seems Mr. Morgan here has been making some interesting claims about his financial situation. Told Judge Crawford he was destitute, needed his wife's domestic skills to survive, but he's also been telling businesses in California that he's got substantial assets back in Montana, including a thriving homestead worked by his wife and children. Daniel's face went pale. That's not... I never said... Got witnesses, Mr. Morgan. Signed statements. Seems you've been playing both ends against the middle, claiming poverty when it suits you and prosperity when it doesn't. Kane's smile was sharp as winter wind. Federal marshals take a dim view of that kind of fraud. You can't prove anything, Daniel blustered, but his hand had moved away from his gun, and his voice lacked conviction. Can I? You see, I've been investigating Judge Harrison's corruption for months. Amazing what you find when you dig into financial records. Payments made, favors exchanged, custody decisions bought and paid for. Kane stepped closer to Daniel, his badge catching the morning light. Including the one that supposedly gave you custody of children you abandoned. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. What does this mean? Means Judge Harrison's custody order is null and void. Means any new proceedings will be handled by federal court, not territorial, and federal judges tend to look more favorably on women who've proven they can protect and provide for their children. Kane looked directly at Grace. Means you're free to make your own choices about your future, Mrs. Morgan. Daniel's face twisted with frustrated rage. This isn't over, he snarled. I'll appeal. I'll find another way. No, Kane said quietly. You won't, because you're under arrest for fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to corrupt legal proceedings. He gestured to two other marshals who'd appeared from the tree line. Mr. Morgan, you're coming with us. As the marshals led Daniel away in shackles, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years. True freedom. Not just freedom from her husband's cruelty and manipulation, but freedom to choose her own path, to build the life she wanted with the people she loved. Mama, Tommy said quietly, is it really over? Grace looked around at the faces surrounding her. Neighbors who'd become family. Children who'd never stopped believing in her strength. A man who'd shown her what love could look like when it was freely given and received. Yes, sweetheart, she said firmly. It's really over. Cole stepped beside her, his arm slipping around her waist with familiar ease. So, he said with that almost smile she'd grown to love, still want to marry a mountain man? Grace laughed, the first truly joyful sound she'd made in longer than she could remember. More than anything, Reverend Walsh cleared his throat. Well, seeing as how we're all here, and the legal obstacles have been removed, he grinned. Anyone object to moving this wedding up a few days? As the community burst into delighted laughter and began making impromptu plans, Grace found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The blizzard that had nearly killed them had actually been their salvation, leading them to shelter that became home, to a stranger who became family, to a community that chose to stand with them when standing was difficult. What are you thinking about? Cole asked softly. Grace smiled up at her soon-to-be husband, her heart full of gratitude and hope. Just wondering what took us so long to find each other. Maybe we had to become the people we needed to be first, Cole replied. Maybe the storm was just the mountain's way of bringing us together when we were ready. As the impromptu wedding preparations swirled around them, Grace pulled her children close and looked out at the peaks that had once seemed so forbidding. Now they looked protective, welcoming, home. In a few hours, she would be Grace Ryder. She would have a husband who saw her strength rather than her weakness, children who knew they were loved unconditionally, and a community that had proven they would fight for justice when justice mattered. She had everything she'd never dared to dream she could have. The storm that had nearly destroyed them had instead cleared the way for something beautiful to grow. And what had grown was strong enough to weather any future storms that might come. They were home, they were family, and nothing, not law, not custom, not the cruel indifference of men who measured worth in ownership rather than love, could change that. The choice had been made, and it was theirs. 1 year later, Grace Ryder stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching her husband teach their son, all three of them were his sons now, legally and lovingly, how to split wood in the golden light of autumn. Tommy, now 11 and growing tall, swung the axe with increasing confidence while Cole guided his movements with patient hands. Lucy sat nearby, her latest book forgotten in her lap as she wove wildflowers into a crown for Jamie, who chattered excitedly about the baby sister he was convinced was coming. Grace smiled, her hand moving instinctively to the gentle swell beneath her dress. Jamie wasn't wrong. Come spring, their family would grow by one more. "Mama," Lucy called, holding up her flower crown. "Do you think the new baby will like flowers as much as I do?" "I think," Grace said, settling beside her daughter on the porch steps, "that any baby born into this family will be surrounded by so much love. They'll learn to appreciate all beautiful things." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the trail, but Grace felt no fear anymore. Visitors meant neighbors, friends, members of the community that had embraced them so completely. This time it was Martha Henley and Doc Peterson riding up for their weekly visit. "Afternoon, Grace," Martha called, dismounting with the spry energy that belied her years. "How are you feeling, dear?" "Strong," Grace replied truthfully. "Happy." "Good to hear. Got a letter for you. Came through the mail run yesterday." Martha handed over an envelope bearing official territorial seals. Grace opened it with only mild curiosity, then felt her breath catch. "Cole," she called, her voice carrying across the yard. He looked up immediately, reading concern in her tone, and crossed to her side with quick strides. "What is it?" Grace held up the letter, her voice bright with amazement. "It's from the territorial governor. Daniel's appeals have been permanently dismissed. All charges against him have been upheld. And," she paused, hardly believing the words, "formal recognition of our marriage and your adoption of the children. It's all official, all legal, all permanent." Cole's face broke into that rare, brilliant smile that still had the power to make her heart race. "Means we're stuck with each other now, Mrs. Ryder." "Forever and always, Mr. Ryder." As the sun set behind the mountains they now called home, Grace gathered her family close, her husband, her children, the community that had chosen to stand with them. The storm that had driven them to Cole's door seemed like a lifetime ago, a different world entirely. But she remembered the woman she'd been that night, desperate and afraid, walking through a blizzard with no destination and no hope. That woman had been focused purely on survival, on making it through one more hour, one more step. The woman she was now wanted so much more than survival. She had love, partnership, a home built on choice rather than obligation. She had children who grew up seeing what healthy relationships looked like, what it meant when people chose each other every day. Most of all, she had the knowledge that some storms, no matter how fierce they seem, are just clearing the way for something better to grow. And what had grown here, in this mountain sanctuary, was strong enough to last forever. They were home, they were family, they were free, and that was everything. Not every family is born. Some are chosen. Some are forged in the heart of the storm and emerge stronger for having weathered it together. Grace's story reminds us that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually clearing the way for the best ones. Her courage to knock on a stranger's door in a blizzard changed everything. Not just for her and her children, but for Cole, who discovered that the solitude he thought he wanted was nothing compared to the family he never knew he needed. What would you do if you were Grace? Would you have had the courage to walk through that blizzard? To stand up to Daniel when he returned? To choose love over security, hope over fear? And what about Cole? Would you have opened your door to strangers in a storm? Risked everything to protect a family that wasn't yours by blood, but became yours by choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment when a stranger's kindness changed your life? Or when you had to choose between what was easy and what was right? Your stories matter, and this community of Wild West Stories listeners is here for them. If Grace and Cole's journey moved you, if you found yourself rooting for their love and their fight for family, Hit that like button to let us know this story touched your heart. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Because out here in the Wild West, there are still so many untold stories of courage, love, and second chances waiting to be shared. Stories of people who refused to give up, who chose hope over despair, who discovered that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for being part of our Wild West Stories family. Until next time, remember, every storm passes, every night ends in dawn, and sometimes the best thing that ever happens to you starts with the courage to knock on a stranger's door. Your words matter here. Your stories matter here. You matter here.